So good afternoon, and welcome to the annual Emmanuel Emroch Lecture. This lecture series was created by Mr. Emroch and his wife, Bertha, and continues to be supported by his son, Walter, and daughter-in-law, Karen. Emmanuel Emroch was a 1931 graduate of the law school and had a very distinguished career as a trial lawyer. He was founder and past president of the Richmond and Virginia Trial Lawyers Association and a member of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. But in addition to that, he was founder of the Richmond chapter of the National Conference of Christians and Jews and was chair of the committee that successfully secured enactment of Virginia's anti-discriminatory advertising law. In 1974, he was honored by the NCCJ with that organization's Humanitarian Award. We're very proud to honor his legacy with this series. We are also very proud to welcome today's Emroch lecturer. Tracey L. Meares is the Walton Hale Hamilton Professor and founding director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. Before joining the faculty at Yale, she was a professor at the University of Chicago School of Law and served as the Max Pam Professor and Director of the Center for Studies in Criminal Justice. In 2014, President Obama named her as a member of the task force on 21st century policing. There's a lot one could say about Professor Meares, and I'll say only a small amount of that so that you'll have more time to hear from her. She's a nationally recognized expert on policing in urban communities, and her research focuses on understanding how members of the public think about their relationship with legal authorities, such as police, prosecutors, and judges. Her work uniquely combines theory with facts on the street. It's deeply grounded in social science research. When someone says, "This is what the community wants," she consistently asks, "How do we know that?" She's argued that we should treat every police-involved death the way the FAA investigates plane crashes. Bring in a team, have them look at everything that happened, and identify the 100 little things that might have been done differently that brought about the incident. Although most of her work focuses on the police and criminal justice system, Professor Meares' work is grounded in a broader insight. As she's explained, reducing crime is not just about individual level interactions between police and people. It's about making sure that the institutions of city government serve the public. And it's also about assuring that our democracy can continue, because our democracy depends on citizens having confidence in their public officials, including the police. Her work is so important and so needed, and we are deeply honored to have here with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tracey Meares.
Good afternoon. That was really a quite wonderful introduction. I give lots of these talks, and I don't think I've ever had an introduction that summarized my work so well. So I'm going to, crib those notes given to the next person. Introduce me. I am, as I've said to a few people, I got the horrible flu that a lot of folks have had. I'm just coming off of it a couple of days ago. So in the afternoon is when my breathing starts getting a little constricted. So I might sort of have to turn and cough a little and drink a little, but I think, and not talk as loudly as I usually do. But with those caveats, let's begin. I'm really thrilled to be here to speak to you today. And I'm especially grateful for the personal invitation I received from my friend, Colonel Lane, who's here in the audience. I've never been to Richmond, Virginia before. Today is my first time, and boy, did I pick a great time to come to Richmond, Virginia. My title is Theories of Community in Popular Legitimacy. I'm using that relatively capacious title as a jumping off point to discuss different ideas of what people are looking for when they come to conclusions about the legal authorities that they deal with every day. So my emphasis is actually on a deeper understanding of the notion of popular legitimacy. And here I mean to distinguish the notion of popular legitimacy, which focuses on what people actually think when they come to conclusions about fairness and the rightfulness or their support for legal authorities like police in social psychological terms. And I want to make clear that what I'm not talking about is normative ideas of legitimacy, which are usually more philosophical. There is, of course, lots of overlap between the two, but I do want you to understand that when I make some certain claims about this is what fairness is, I am actually talking about empirical work primarily that we have been doing over the past few decades, actually showing that when people come to X conclusion, when they say that this police officer's action was right or fair, they are tying it to these particular factors, which I have investigated. And then a final ground clearing point. The legal authorities most pertinent to what I'm going to talk about today are police, but as the dean already mentioned, this work generalizes. It's also relevant to how people understand the fairness of judges and prosecutors, other administrative actors. We have tied this work to people's assessments of public school teachers and managers in business. It's incredibly general, generative even. The reason why I focus on police is primarily because they are the state actor with which the most people come in contact with on a regular basis. That's one. And second, well, you could also say public school teachers, but the second point I think will emphasize the point, and that is they have a very particular weighty symbolic salience in how people understand themselves with respect to their relationship to the state and their actual understanding of themselves as citizens, as I'll explain later. So one usually doesn't think about your relationship with a public school teacher as telling you that much about who you are as a citizen. That's not the case with police. Okay, so the basic question that I'm going to be trying to answer today is for what reasons does the public confer legitimacy on the police? If one asks the police what the public cares about, for the last several years or so, they would say something like, well, the public wants the police to be very effective crime fighters. And of course, that goal conveniently aligns with how police currently, today for the most part, define their tasks. It also aligns with the goals that many political leaders who are hiring the police executives to lead the agencies that carry out these tasks set for those executives, right? So effective policing then becomes a mandate for policing that keeps the public safe. But here's a problem. Crime, including violent crime, has dropped precipitously over the last 30 years. And yet during this time, the most readily available empirical measures of the regard with which people hold the police as a general matter, I'm talking about Gallup polls and the like, how much confidence do you have in your local police and such. These measures have remained largely flat. Moreover, there's an incredible gap between the ratings that Black Americans give to police and white Americans, and this is true even though Black Americans as a group have experienced the largest reductions of victimizations, violent victimizations in particular as a group over the last 30 years, for reasons that are not entirely attributable to the actions of the police, but certainly are linked to the efforts of law enforcement officers. So, if the public actually cares primarily about policing that is effective at crime reduction, and crime, especially violent crime, has dropped, and we know that police have contributed to this drop, how do we explain the fact that the confidence curve is flat? That's not what we would expect to see, right? One answer might be that the public cares about something else. So what would that be? Well, the walls and the main stairway at Yale Law School where I teach are covered with pages and pages of simple pieces of white paper. Looks like this. It's actually cardstock though. And they're emblazoned with simple black block print. And on these pieces of paper, the names of Americans killed by police in encounters or police custody have been stamped. Names such as Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Rekia Boyd, Walter Scott, Sylville Smith, and I could go on. Now, some of us in this room have seen the ways in which these victims were actually killed as their tragic deaths have been played and replayed on social media. And in the face of these killings and hundreds, thousands more incidents of non-fatal shootings, harmings, and the like, some have called for more of an emphasis on civil rights and lawfulness with respect to thinking about how to organize the work that policing agencies do. More lawful policing. The Obama administration responded during Barack Obama's presidency. For example, between 2008 and 2012, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Section initiated 11 investigations of agencies under Section 14141. That's the law that allows the Civil Rights Section to investigate systematic violations of civil rights by policing agencies. And that same section negotiated 19 more reform agreements. So it's a huge increase in civil rights activity. And of course, policing in New York City is almost synonymous with legal excess, where the notion of stop, question, and frisk is not associated with the tactics sanctioned by the Supreme Court in the case of Terry versus Ohio, decided in 1968, which is still legal, the tactic. But instead, that term, stop, question, and frisk, is associated with hundreds and thousands of forcible encounters with mostly youths of color that turned up contraband and or dangerous weapons in the tiniest fraction of cases. Now, fatal police shootings and legally problematic programmatic stop and frisk strategies call out for legal intervention. So perhaps then, the reason why the evidence for public support for police remained largely flat during a period of substantial crime decline is that the public cares about the fact that police should behave lawfully more than they care about whether police are effective crime fighters. One problem with this idea, though, is that the best evidence we have does not seem to support this conclusion either. Now, Tom Tyler and I, along with sociologist Robert Sampson, Chris Winship, and criminologist Anthony Braga, conducted a nationwide experimental survey in 2008 designed to identify key factors influencing public views about how people understand the fairness of their interactions with police and what factors support those things. In particular, we wanted to know how people came to conclusions about good policing that they supported and wanted. Was it about police being effective crime fighters? Was it about police bringing offenders to justice regardless of whether that activity resulted in lower crime rates, a sort of Kantian idea? Was it about the fact that police observed the dictates of constitutional law as they carried out their duties, engaging with the public? Or was it something else? So our study had two parts. One was a relatively standard questionnaire focusing on the demographic information of our respondents, their experience with crime and victimization, the experiences of crime and victimization of people connected to them. And the other part was an experiment. In the experimental component of the study, we showed respondents 3 videos of different police-citizen encounters in randomized order. Now, these videos we actually culled from police training tapes and YouTube videos, and they were 30 seconds long and captured real interactions between police and officers. And the incidents that were captured varied in intensity in terms of the interactions that people were having with the police. So I'm going to give you a quick description of the 3 videos. The first we called resisting arrest. In this case, we had a courteous but stern police officer who confronted a rude citizen during a nighttime traffic stop. And this person, the cop, attempts to place the citizen under arrest, but the citizen resists. In the second video, we called violent struggle. 2 police officers engage in a violent struggle with a large aggressive citizen in a parking lot at night. And in the third video, which we call ambiguous arrest, a police officer questions a shirtless young man who appears to be confused, and eventually the police officer leads him away in handcuffs. Now, the actual experiment was not giving the respondents a chance to look at these videos and then asking them what they thought. The critical aspect of the experiment was that before watching each video, the respondents were provided a brief framing paragraph telling them what happened so that they could actually interpret appropriately, for our purposes appropriately, what was happening. And we manipulated 4 different dimensions. First, a description of the city in which it occurred. And by that I mean, was this a city that was characterized by good police relations, bad police relations, or neutral? Second, a description of the conditions under which the stop or arrest was made. In particular, this second factor gave them information that constituted whether the stop or arrest was clearly constitutional, clearly unconstitutional, or ambiguous. Third, a description of the officer's reputation and history. This person has been commended every year by the local city council, or this person has serious problems in his background and is under investigation by the Internal Affairs Division, or neutral. And then last, a description of the citizen's prior behavior. Was this a citizen who was a fine, upstanding citizen? Is it a person who had been in trouble with the law before? Is this just neutral? The neutral is just sort of ambiguous information. Okay, so our respondents were primed with different combinations of this information. They watched the video, and then they had to answer 38 questions about what had occurred in the video that they watched. And we designed these questions to explore the psychological processes underlying their reactions to ambiguous events. We were actually interested not only in how they rated the cop's behavior in each case, we actually wanted to know whether the framing changed their assessment of the facts at hand. That was a whole separate paper, which I won't talk about now, but it's pretty fascinating how people don't necessarily see the same thing, right? Depending on how you frame a video like this. Now, the results of our experiment were striking, but not surprising, I guess, at least to someone who studies the social psychology of legitimacy. And you can actually find the results in a paper called Lawful or Fair. It was published in 2015 in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology at Northwestern. It took us like that long to analyze all this data. For our respondents, whether or not the police behavior was clearly legal or not. And remember, for us, legality was whether the police officer's behavior violated constitutional law, right? So that's the dimension of legality we're talking about. Their assessment of legality simply didn't determine whether or not the respondent believed that punishment or some other consequence was warranted for the officer in the video. What did matter? The respondent's assessment of whether the officer acted in a procedurally just way, okay? So now I'm going to explain all of the stuff that I do that the dean already gave you the preview of, so you can skip through that really quickly. No, I'm going to take my time. The centerpiece of the social psychology of procedural justice is that people are motivated to comply with the law, cooperate with authorities, engage with them when they are treated fairly. And decades of research support the conclusion that fair treatment matters a lot more to people than outcomes that favor them or the effectiveness of authorities at combating crime when people are making evaluations of those authorities that they're dealing with. And the research I just described to you also shows that fair treatment is not really the same as legality for the purposes of the general public either, right? So legality doesn't seem to matter, effectiveness doesn't seem to matter, and the extent to which the outcome favors you is not going to matter the most. It's not that none of these things matters, let's be clear, and we can get into that in the question and answer. It's about what matters the most and how is it shaped. So here's what matters, 4 things. We know that the public wants to be listened to when policies are created, and in their individual interactions with an authority, they want to have an opportunity to state their case and tell their side of the story. And it's really important to people that they have these opportunities, even when it makes no difference to the outcome. Second, we know that people care a lot about what we call fair decision making. And by that I mean people are looking for indicia that allow them to determine that decision makers, authorities are acting in unbiased ways, are acting in ways that are consistent, in ways that are connected to facts, factuality. There's like a basis for the decision. The decision is not just coming down because the authority said, this is what I want to do. People need to have the kind of information that will allow them to make an assessment about whether they feel a law or rule is being applied consistently and appropriately across people and situations. Transparency, for example, really matters. In addition to the quality of fair decision making, people are looking for what we call the quality of treatment. And with respect to this valence, people are looking for acknowledgement of their needs and concerns, as well as evidence of a police officer, say, but it could be any legal authorities, sincere efforts to act on behalf of the group they care about, the group to which they belong. They care about being treated respectfully, with dignity, concern for their rights, right? So disrespect, of course, looms large here. Finally, people care about being able to assess whether the legal authorities they're dealing with will treat them benevolently in the future. They look for what we've called in the research normative alignment with legal authorities. And it's important to understand that, especially with respect to this last factor, it's not transactional, right? Or simply transactional, I should say. So when you are dealing with someone in a particular transaction, you can say, well, is this person treating me with respect? Are they giving me particular facts that will help me to evaluate the decision that they are making? Are they actually allowing me to tell my side of the story? These are transactional factors. But this last factor often goes beyond the particular context that a person is making the evaluation. It might rely on information that has nothing to do with the particular person, so networks matter a lot. How do you treat the people that I care about or people that I'm connected to? History matters a lot. It's obvious that in making an assessment about whether you can expect to be treated benevolently in the future, and you fled from the Deep South to Chicago where police treated your family in a particular way, and you were confronted with police in Chicago, your expectation about the benevolence with which the Chicago cop is going to treat you, of course, is going to be informed by your experience with cops in the South. But that's what I mean, right? Those connections. Generational transactions matter. Now, all of these ideas, I think, can be summarized colloquially in this way. In their interactions with authorities, people want to believe that the authority they're dealing with believes that they count. And they make this assessment by looking to see how they're treated by that authority and how that authority treats people who are connected to them and who are like them. And they make this reference, they make this judgment with reference to how they're treated, because since what they're looking for is some information about the belief, do you believe that I'm a person that counts, since I can't read your mind most days? I'm going to make this assessment by looking to how you treat me. Now, once you see that how people are treated matters to them, as opposed to the ends or outcomes of the treatment, it may be a little confusing, maybe, that legality doesn't seem to matter that much. But here let me point out that constitutional law, as it's currently composed, those of you who've had criminal procedure know this, doesn't really focus very much on how police are treating people. I mean, for that, one can just look to Graham versus Connor, I think. Instead, typically the constitutional law that circumscribes police action pays much more attention to the reasons why police are acting, as opposed to the quality of treatment. So, if you can summarize all this stuff, I think you would say something like there's a mismatch on many levels between the goals of policing as defined with respect to certain outcomes, crime reduction most primarily, the legal determinants that shape policing, which focus on justifications rather than how the activity is actually carried out, and what the public wants, right, from these critical state actors. Now, I think at this point it's useful to pause a bit and talk a little bit about why it is that the public cares about the factors that I mentioned, right? So I've told you that the research shows pretty clearly that these are the 4 factors that people care about. But why is it that they care about these things and don't care about other things, like effectiveness and legality and such? And the best information that we have on that is that people are always looking for information about their status in society, right? We're fundamentally social creatures, and we're looking for information about our status individually, and we're looking for information about the status of the groups to which we belong. And in that world, the way in which very prominent facets of the state treat you as an individual or treat you as a group gives you lots of information. I mean, I get information about my status by how my friends treat me, but I get even more information. It's a very salient source of information to me when I'm looking to how some important actor of the state treats me. And so, of course, Black people in Ferguson got lots of information about the extent to which they were considered high status or low status citizens of Missouri, and the people of Baltimore were very much aware that they were treated very differently by police if they lived in West Baltimore, which is predominantly minority and poor, compared to the Inner Harbor neighborhood in Baltimore, right? So that sort of whole concept is giving them lots of information about how much they matter. And these ideas about procedural justice and legitimacy have actually had very powerful resonance over the last several years. So as the Dean mentioned, I was honored to serve on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, which was convened shortly after Michael Brown and Eric Garner were killed. And we provided to the president 59 recommendations across 6 pillars of policing. The first was building trust and legitimacy. The second, policy and oversight. Third, social media and technology. Fourth, community policing and crime reduction. Fifth, training and education. And sixth, officer safety and wellness. But pillar 1, this idea about building trust and legitimacy, was actually the foundation of all of our recommendations. And much of the work following the announcement of these recommendations has been what I would call technocratic, right? There's been a huge emphasis on organizational change and transparency, and a major investment on training officers with respect to these new principles. And I think all of that is good, right? But critics, I think rightly, worry about the ways in which these kinds of technocratic efforts can potentially obscure necessary change. And they worry that training officers to do the same old job in a new and less harmful way doesn't really change policing as we know it. And that's why some people are calling for the abolition of police. At a fundamental level, I don't disagree with them. I actually wrote an essay about this in the Boston Review about a year ago. And I made the argument that policing as we know it must be abolished before it can be transformed. And in the essay, I argue that critics of police abolition caricature the abolitionist view when they assume that police abolition simply means no police, right? The attack is unsurprising given that it comes often from a group of people who think that crime reduction on the part of police is self-justifying, which is, I think, an approach that too many effectiveness proponents take. And this is a straw man. Obviously, people in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee which are experiencing unacceptably high levels of violence worry about the violence in their neighborhoods. They also worry about government excess. So in the Boston Review essay, I quote Mariama Kaba, who's argued, and I'm quoting her right now, for me, prison, she's talking about prison abolition, is about two things. It's the complete and utter dismantling of prison and policing and surveillance as they currently exist within our culture. It's also about the building up of new ways of intersecting and new ways of relating to each other. Now, I say more about the problems of the arguments of police abolitionist critics in the Boston Review essay, which I recommend to you. But I also right now want to point out some issues in the arguments of the abolitionists. And I hope what I'm doing here, I consider what I'm doing here to be a friendly amendment to their work. And I think the issue can easily be seen by going back to Kaba. She makes 2 points, one about dismantling and one about building up. And a lot of energy of the movement, the police abolition movement, is understandably focused on dismantling. There's a lot of too much, right? There's too much stopping, too much frisking, too much low-level engagement, too much attention to low-level violations, too many deaths, too many shootings, so on. Just too much, and there's too much violence in too many places. And I say all of this really cognizant of the great success that we've had in the crime decline. Let me just pause here and give you a sense of how great of the success of the crime decline in the last 30 years has been. I'm actually relying on Pat Sharkey's work, who's a sociologist at NYU, and Pat has a wonderful statistic in his new book where he says the increase in life expectancy that African American men today experience as a result of the decline in homicide over the last 30 years is roughly what we would see if obesity were eradicated from African American men. That's stunning. That's huge. That is a crazy, crazy high number, right? But, to say that, and to the extent that police have played some role in it, to say that they just get to keep doing what they're doing, but in a more humane way, is also just not good enough. One way to think about it is to say this, that reduction of the bad of policing is more humane, but it's not a citizenship project, right? And when you get back fundamentally to the role that police play in the society, you have to understand their role is signaling to people, right? What it means to be citizens. So this is where I think one could really plumb what abolition means and what it could mean. Abolition of slavery was never about simply eradicating the legal category of enslaved people. It was never just about that. It was also about the project of establishing citizenship for the formerly enslaved. This is about dismantling the eradication of the legal category, but it's also about building up. So my project, my argument, is that policing is a project of citizenship because it ought to be conceptualized and carried out as a public good in a very particular kind of way. And if policing right now is carried out by concentrating the costs of producing that good on a very small group of people, such as Black people and Black men in particular, it's hard to say that the good is good or even truly public. Right? We have to have a good that we all can enjoy. And I think the major move here then is to understand the role that police play, as I said before, in generating an understanding of ourselves as citizens, right? Noting that in both historical examples, police serve to enforce very strict limits on who could enjoy the rights of citizenships, and also in current era, are continuing to play a very complicated role in terms of limiting people's rights of truly enjoying freedom in the spaces in which they live. Criminologist Ian Loader and sociologist Aon Mulcahy, I think that's how you say his name, not really sure, put it this way, and I'm quoting, "Police are an interpretive lens through which people make sense of and give order to their world, a vehicle that enables individuals and groups to make sense of their past, form judgments on the present, and project various imagined futures. As an institution intimately concerned with the viability of the state, policing remains closely tied to the maintenance of ontological security, the production of subjectivities, and the articulation of collective identities." I think what they're saying here, right, is that how police treat us not only give us information about how we understand ourselves, but it also gives everybody else information about how they should understand the role of everybody else in society. So it's really important that we come up with a symbolic language that helps us make sense of what they should be doing. And the way I like to think about it is to focus on these ideas of the public good, ideas about what it means to say that policing itself is a public thing. Bonnie Honig is a political theorist, and she wrote in a kind of it is amazing. There's just part of it that is analyzing a movie that gets kind of interesting. I was going to say weird, but interesting. But the part that's relevant for us, she says, look, we spend a lot of time talking about democracy by focusing on constitutions and procedures and commitments to formal equality and who gets to be part about the demos. But we spend less time talking about the objects of democracy, the public things. And I think because we have spent very little time talking about, as a group, what it is we actually really want police to do for us, not just two people, we haven't seriously understood what it would mean to reconceptualize policing. Okay, so I'm going to skip because I want to have a little time for questions. But the bottom line here then is to tie this idea of reconceptualizing policing as a public good, but also come back to the idea of abolition, and in particular, focusing on reconstruction, right? Because I think reconstruction is actually a word that can give us a path to thinking seriously about the kind of symbolic work we need to do, and reconceptualizing policing in a way that actually makes it work for everyone. So let me just say this about thinking of a more friendly way for people to think about police abolition when they hear it. When you hear those words, I want you not just to think about the abolition word, I want you to think about the reconstruction part of abolition. And so think about the 13th Amendment, right? The 13th Amendment was a legal mechanism that abolished slavery, yes. But of course, the passage of the 13th Amendment didn't magically create a world in which formerly enslaved African Americans suddenly enjoyed the benefits of citizenship that they were denied over 150 years. There was a tragically short 11, 12-year period that was designed to do that work. We know that for years and years and years, that Reconstruction period was discredited by many, and of course, most famously by the Dunning School of History, housed at Columbia. But we also know, and W.E.B. Du Bois's classic magisterial 1935 book documents the efforts that people took to try to create a space for themselves as citizens. That's where I think we should look to when we're thinking about how to do this work. And in particular, I think we should pay attention to the true notion of police power, right? So think about the police power as a constitutional matter, as the capacity of the states to regulate behavior and enforce order within their territory for the betterment of the health, safety, and morals and general welfare of their inhabitants. This is an invitation to think about policing as a public good in order, I think, to fulfill the promise of Reconstruction. So in this way, we won't simply imagine a policing that occupies the exact same footprint that we have now, but instead we imagine policing that actually reconstructs the relationship that people of color, especially race-class subjugated people, have with the criminal justice system, but also, importantly, the relationship that we all have, right, with the criminal justice system. So let me end with this. This is a little thought experiment. The idea of citizenship that I am working with here is not just about, eradication of legal categories and building up an institution that is going to be better for people who have been subjugated. But you should understand it as a project that actually realigns everyone's relationship within this context, because it cannot be the case that John C. Calhoun was even a citizen of the republic that he purported to be a citizen of, in a world in which that citizenship that he claimed required subjugation of people who were undeniably citizens. And that's where I'll stop. Yeah, we have 10 minutes. I had like 15 minutes of stuff I had to cut out.
That was so great. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your work with us. I really appreciate it. So I found myself asking two questions. The first is, on the one hand, we've got this massive reduction of crime, and those statistics I'm also familiar with, so I'm like, yeah, that's really happening. On the other hand, we have mass incarceration, and we have a massive use, political use, of crime and the fear of crime in our political discourse today. So I wondered if you could talk about, those things are very much in tension, both of them, I think. And so I just wondered if you could talk about that in the context of, of what's happening today. So you've got this massive drop in crime, and yet we're less confident, and yet we're incarcerating so many people.
Well, Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have incarcerated so many people. I mean, I think in most places, you know, I don't have these numbers at my fingertips, but I think the pace of incarceration in the most populous places has definitely slowed. What we are living with is the consequences of having put lots of people in prison for a long period of time back then. Right? So if you look at a place like Texas, for example, you know, on the one hand, they would say, well, there's this great benefit. We have a much smaller incarcerated population, which they do. It's also the case that it looks like their flow has not really diminished. In other words, they're like churning people through, right? Which you can churn people through and have a much lower stock. It's a stock and flow problem when you think about this statistically. So, you know, that's definitely an issue. But I see you saying something different, which is how do we change the way in which crime is or is not? I mean, I think that's an open empirical question and the sort of a focal point of how we organized policy to, you know, deliver people what I would call local policy goods, right? And one issue is that, you know, delivery of those goods are very segmented. So in urban areas, you know, the primary face of the state that people of color, Black people in particular, see is the police. It is the social service agency, in a sense, that people see. And, you know, that's the thing that I think is actually enduring over time. One of the best books on this is Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, Condemnation of Blackness. That's been true essentially since, you know, the 1930s. And that's the piece, I think, that needs to change.
That's great. So, and the other piece of this was, what do you talked about sort of this bureaucratic response to your suggestions, and I'm wondering, what do you think it should look like? You know, how do we, what is your vision for that reconstructive process?
Yeah.
And I guess part of what I had in mind was, frankly, you know, even as people are coming out of mass incarceration, you have this whole population that, and I don't know what the statistics are, I feel like it's like maybe 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 Black men have had contacts with the criminal justice system. And I really got what you were saying about the way that they're treated, giving them information and giving others information. So I thought about that population in particular.
So I want to be clear that I'm not criticizing the agencies that have undertaken these technocratic changes. I actually think it's good. And you have to start somewhere. And I also don't think that for many of them that the changes are small, actually. You know, to actually undertake to train agencies, you know, your full personnel in these ways of thinking, and, you know, make real commitments to de-escalation and make real commitments to changes in policy on the ground, which they do, you know, sort of combating the proliferation of criminalization with very specific policies that says, you know what, I don't care that shoplifting is actually part of the Maryland Criminal Code. You actually cannot arrest someone for doing this. You can give them a citation, you can have a certain kind of engagement with them, but you actually can't arrest them, which means we're not going to be in a position, really, of the fact that because you couldn't arrest someone, they end up losing their life, right, for selling 3 cigarettes on a corner. So, gosh, I totally lost my train of thought on that. This is the lauding of technocratic. So I actually think that's good, right? I mean, the problem is that, you know, the work has a really deep and complicated history, and I don't mean complicated in the sense that all of the tendrils have to be disentangled. I just mean complicated in the sense that it's not just police that, you know, put us in the position that we are in. I mean, there's the ways in which municipal government supported residential segregation and lack of funding of the schools. And, we could go on and on about, the ways in which these things are tied together that police activity then supports in certain ways. And so to expect even beyond technocratic change on the part of police to change this situation without having a really serious reckoning of, what we want our municipal governments to be doing, I think, is sort of a fool's errand. So that's really, it was very abstract, but that's what I mean when I say we have to think about the police power, right? The police power is not just policing as we understand it right now, right? It's really about the kinds of services that municipal and state governments are delivering to us, one component of which might have an aspect that looks like criminal justice as, we understand it, but a lot of it is not really going to be that, right?
Thank you so much for coming. We're so fortunate to be able to have great speakers here under this program. I was just curious exactly what your ideal vision of this abolished and then reconstructed system would look like, because to me, I'm just having a hard time distinguishing between these technocratic changes and this idea of reconstruction, because it seems like what you're really after is reconstruction or transformation, which may not actually require the use of the word abolition or an actual destruction of the police force for 3 months, while we try to figure it out, a concept like that. So just a couple key tenets maybe of what that reconstructed police force might look like.
Yeah, so it's not, so when I say reconstruction, I am actually talking about the possibility of fulfilling at a fundamental level. I'm talking about the possibility of fulfilling the promises of the 13th Amendment, okay? So, although I am also talking about reconstruction of the police as a concept, but, that's the starting off point. And we know that the first Reconstruction did not achieve that, even though it had some benefits. And people commonly call the civil rights movement, or people have called, I'm not sure what they call it around here, the second Reconstruction. And in the face of, all these incidents of police brutality and the like, in 2015, people started making this call for a third Reconstruction. I thought, that's really interesting. As I was reading that in the news and, in sort of the popular intelligentsia outlets, like Boston Review and The Atlantic and such. And I thought, well, what could that mean? What are they talking about? Because these things were happening at the same time that people were making this call for police abolition. And then I felt like it was just, talking about police abolition as a concept made it too easy for people to say what you just did, which is, well, I'm having trouble, understanding, what it means to not have the agency for a particular time. And I don't really think that that's what people mean, although they make arguments like that, because they're understandably super concerned about reducing harm. And one way to reduce harm is just to say, just don't do anything. Just stay inside. Don't go anywhere, right? When the planes were grounded, the air was clear. Like that kind of, put everybody on the ground. But I feel like we ought to be up to the deeper challenge, right? The deeper challenge of actually having a conversation about, again, I'm just repeating myself, what the relationship is that people should have to the government that serves them, and what kinds of opportunities the state needs to make available to people And that might imply certain configurations involving criminal justice system agencies that we know today, and it might imply other kinds of arrangements where you actually have social workers who are available 24/7 in the way that armed police officers are available. Like, I don't know. I don't know. But I also know that it's a mistake to try to think about that without thinking about the whole package. And so, again, I go back to abolition. If we actually thought that you were going to achieve the promises of abolition of slavery by abrogating the legal category of slavery, but then everything else stayed the same, So we could still have convict leasing. White people could still be paid more than black people. You could still lynch people. You could have a world in which only white people basically got Social Security and could go to good public schools. Oh, wait. Was that the world that we lived in? Yes. Right? Then the point is that that's not abolition. So that's my point. Like, if you're going to just say that eradicating the agency as we know it simply means that while keeping everything else the same, then we're not actually having what I consider to be an abolition conversation, because abolition necessarily entails reconstruction. That's the point. Yeah.
So this is really helpful, because I was listening to the talk and I was thinking that your project kind of brings us into two different ideas and tensions that we've had about what the American state is and what it does. So one is this sort of right to be let alone and negative liberty idea, right? That the role of the state is to get out of your way so you can create your business, do your thing. And then the role of police is, if someone is getting in your way, right, the sort of Millian idea of liberty, that the police step in. But the other, which sometimes has won in our history and sometimes is lost, is that the state creates conditions of security, that the state regulates because it's producing citizens, and it's involved in this larger process of citizenship. So my first question was, I felt, listening to your lecture, that sort of that's where your project is and where you are, and is that right? And second, if that is right, how do you deal with this tension that we're always dealing with, whether we're talking about labor and employment law, which I write about, or policing, where people say that's not historically the role of the American state. You're asking for a richer, thicker notion of the state that,
I think so yes, to the latter. And with respect to the idea, like the role of government is to get out of the way, I think that's a caricature of reality. I think the people who say that actually aren't actually historically accurate or paying attention to reality, right? And we know that to be true, especially with the ways in which the state treated certain groups of people, I've been focusing on the formerly enslaved, but we could go down the list, and to say that those people were let alone by the state, we know that that's just not true, and people just don't get to tell selective stories about that. That's all I have to say. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that if you look at definitions of community policing in the literature, you're going to see lots of different ways of understanding it that range from community policing is just a tactic that particular police officers engage in, like walking a beat or riding a bike or a horse or whatever they do, to an idea that you should have the same police officers in a community so that they get to know the people who live there and understand their wants and needs. when I think about the idea of community policing, I think it's most helpful to join it with the social psychology of procedural justice that I was just talking about. So that is looking at what it takes for people to understand or come to conclusions about the fairness of the legal authorities that they are going to be dealing with, who will be engaging in the community policing, number one. Number two, understanding that for the most part, most people obey the law most of the time. And that's because we police ourselves, as you said, right? And so then the question is, well, how do we have, what kind of role can a state actor play to help us support our own natural ways of enforcing, norms of organizing our lives? And what I like to then point out in that context is to say that police officers are agents of a community. And if they are agents of a community, then that means the community is a principal. And the principal's job is to dictate goals and projects for its agent. And so if you think about it that way, then what you would want to most effectively carry out community policing is to ensure that you have an organizational structure that allows a principal to effectively dictate goals and projects for, the relevant community. And in most places, we don't see that, right? We see an organizational structure that's upended, where police talk about the community isn't helping us do whatever. And whenever you hear that, you should immediately say, well, what are you talking about? Like, it's not their job actually to do this for you. It is actually your job to do what they want. So you should try to figure out or have a structure that makes clear that makes their goals for you to carry out clear. And I've seen maybe 3 cities in which this is done well. In which this is done. Los Angeles has an organizational body to which the police executive is responsible, and it is the job of that body to articulate goals and projects for the agency, which the executive then carries out. Seattle has a version of this. Chicago is struggling towards it right now. But I don't believe that we will have effective community policing until we have a thoroughgoing commitment to an organizational structure that requires the people who are leading these agencies, to carry out these goals. And by that, I don't mean that these goals should be these bodies should be micromanaging, right? I'm a big fan of bureaucratic expertise. But I do think that one major failing of the notion of community policing is that members of communities actually are falling down on their job of being a principal, and they need to take that job over.